Does anyone else remember seeing this rating on video games? It was pretty prominent in the early to mid 1990s and stood for kids to adults. But at the turn of the millennium, it was phased out and replaced with the more universal E rating. Now we all know about the infamous AO rating, adults only, one that most have actually never seen in real life before, as most retailers have bans on selling adult only games. Though there are some really unique instances that we will talk about shortly. What about EC, which was officially discontinued, or the time they introduced E10 How does this system compare to ratings systems in other countries, and when has there been discrepancies? The Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB, was started as a response to growing concerns about the content and appropriateness of video games. This became a thing in 1994 as a self-regulatory organization for the video game industry in the United States. At that time, there was a significant increase in the popularity of video games, and as the medium evolved, it became more diverse and targeted various age groups. This raised concerns amongst parents, policymakers, and advocacy groups about the potential impact of violent or explicit content to children. Some of the biggest games that were brought up in various hearings were that of Mortal Kombat, Doom, and a game known as Night Trap, which simulated like a home invasion or something. It was actually really goofy. In response to these concerns, major video game industry stakeholders, including console manufacturers and software publishers, came together to create the ESRB. The goal was to provide a standardized system for rating video games based on their content and age appropriateness, similar to the existing rating systems used in other entertainment media, such as movies, for example. It was at this time that the original rating system was created by the ESRB, which would go on to be used for mostly the following 3 decades. There was EC, which was for early childhood, for games that were aimed at preschool audiences under 3 years old. There was KA, which stood for kids to adults, meaning that the game was suitable for all ages, though it may have minimal cartoon, fantasy, or mild violence, or even infrequent use of mild language. Then there was T rating, which was a game suitable for all players 13 years and older, and it might have some violence, some suggestive themes and crude humor, minimal blood, and infrequent use of strong language. And then there was M rating, which was for players 17 years and older, which would allow for games violence, blood and gore, drug use, nudity, sexual content, and crude humor. But then the step higher than that was adults only, for players 18 years and older exclusively, which were games that had either over-the-top violence, prolonged scenes of intense graphic sexual content, or gambling. And then there was RP, which stood for rating pending, which meant that the ESRB hadn't fully reviewed what the game would be just yet. Likewise, during this time, other countries that chose not to adopt the ESRB rating system would typically adopt their own rating system with different adjustments to the age groups, and we'll go into that in a moment. But for the most part, the creation of the ESRB highly mirrored the movie rating system that had been in place for half a century and had more recently seen some revisions, bringing the rating system for movies into the modern age that we have nowadays with G, PG, PG-13R, and NC-17, or no children 17 and under. Now, the establishment of the ESRB aimed to empower consumers, particularly parents, by providing them with information to make informed decisions about the games their children play. It also helped the industry self-regulate and address concerns without the need for government intervention or restrictive legislation. However, things haven't always been the smoothest when it came to ESRB and its rating systems. Over the years, there's been a lot of controversy, criticisms, and unique instances where the rating system was put under a lot of scrutiny. Over the years, Grand Theft Auto has always been a game that's come under fire, getting surrounded in controversy. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, released in 2004, and actually received an AO rating from the ESRB for a brief period of time. This change occurred due to the discovery of a hidden and inaccessible minigame called the Hot Coffee mod. The Hot Coffee mod was a piece of game code that allowed players to access explicit sexual content that was originally left out of the game, but still was present in the game's code. Modders discovered and unlocked this content, enabling players to access, honestly, a pretty goofy sex minigame involving the main character and his girlfriend. Once news of this mod spread, it generated a significant amount of controversy as it violated the game's original rating of M, which meant that the ESRB would would investigate the situation and go about re-evaluating the game. As a result, they temporarily changed the rating from M to AO, indicating the game was intended now for players 18 and older due to the newly discovered explicit content. This change had significant consequences for the game's distribution and availability. Major retailers and console manufacturers, including Walmart, Target, and Sony, refused to carry any game that has the AO rating due to their policies, so for a brief period of time, the game was inaccessible for people who wanted to purchase the game, and consequently, Rockstar Games, the publisher of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, faced immense pressure to address the situation. In response, Rockstar released a patch to remove the hot coffee mod and disable access to the explicit content. They also implemented measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. The ESRB then subsequently re-evaluated the game and changed the rating back to M. Still, the ESRB did pick up a bit of controversy for their initial decision to change the game to the AO rating, as the hot coffee mod was technically inaccessible to any player who did not utilize a third-party hacking device to obtain the content hidden away in the game. The hot coffee mod otherwise was completely inaccessible by normal gameplay means. The ESRB would find itself in more controversy a few years later when Bethesda's game Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion would release and initially had a T rating based on the information provided initially. However, just a few months after the release of the game, the ESRB actually changed its ruling on Oblivion and changed the rating of the game to M rating due to some violent things found in the game that initially were not accessible. On the PC version of the game, if players utilized an unauthorized third-party tool, it would allow players to gain access to a specific art file that would allow players to have topless female characters. In response to this accessibility, the ESRB conducted a re-review of Oblivion, and the game would receive a mature rating instead. At the cost of Bethesda, they would have to promptly notify all retailers of the change, issue stickers for retailers and distributors to affix on the product. They would have to have the new rating shown on all promotional materials and make edits to any type of video promotion that would go on television. They would also go back and make an update rendering the topless skin file unaccessible. And according to an article on GameSpot, Bethesda complied with the request but disagreed with the ESRB's rationale. This actually ended up drawing even more criticism towards ESRB on both fronts. There was a game legislation advocate, Yi Berades, whom Edge magazine quoted, stating that the firm has shown that they cannot police themselves, and plain and simply, the current rating system is drastically flawed, and here is yet another reason why we need legislation to assist parents and protect children. Yeah, so he was calling for government intervention in overseeing censorship penalties and rating systems in video games, which is kind of the opposite of what most gamers themselves probably believe in, but just the fact that there's criticism coming from both sides against the ESRB is something worth noting here. Other countries have gone more in depth on having government-led rating policies, which we'll get into a little bit later in this video because it is interesting to see how that actually affects the games directly. But there was a couple more instances with the ESRB we wanted to talk about first. In 2015, there was a game called 2064 Read-Only Memories. It originally had the M rating due to language. However, when an enhanced version of the original game was re-released, the ESRB only rated it T, which, okay, whatever, but it seemed to contradict a lot of the things that the ESRB had previously rated other games a more strict rating for, especially because of the use of stronger language in this game. The ESRB would then backpedal their decision, changing the rating of the game to M again, which just seemed odd. Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney, typically gets a T rating in most of the games. However, the game Dual Destinies was the first title to receive an M rating, which caused confusion due to it mostly containing the same content and similar writing styles of previous titles. The only thing that some players were able to maybe conclude as to why it got an M rating instead was because the game utilized the 3D technology on the 3DS, making the game more realistic, I guess. Super Smash Bros. Is another game that gets a T rating because it features characters like Pikachu, Mario, and Link fighting, although in most of their respective series, they all fight, and a lot of the times their games are only rated E, but if they fight each other, it's rated T. Then there was also a game called Hatred, which had many complaints, saying that the game was rated AO simply as a technique to get more press and marketing, but people who actually played the game and critics of the game actually said that the violence appeared to them to be no more graphic than something you would see in a regular M-rated game in the past. For instance, the merciless killing that was so controversial was fine in the M-rated Postal series, which released years earlier. It also seems like in an attempt to calm some of the confusion by the rating system that the ESRB has had, has led to the ESRB shifting how they rate some of the games. For instance, in 1998, KA was finally replaced with E, which is what they originally wanted, but due to trademarking issues, it was unclear if they could use E when it finally cleared. But in 2005, E10 was introduced, adding this window for children who are 10 and older but aren't quite 13 just yet, and would see games like Donkey Kong, Jungle Beat, and Shadow the Hedgehog release. And ooh, look how edgy Shadow the Hedgehog was for an E10 game. In 2018, early childhood rating would be discontinued due to the underuse of the rating system. All the way since its inception in 1994, only 268 games ever were rated EC. And then there's, of course, the games that were originally rated adult only that would then have to be modified down so that they could pass the M rating and go into retail. The 2004 game The Punisher was edited down from AO to M. This game Fahrenheit had to have sex scenes removed from the game in 2005 to get an M rating. And one of the most controversial ones was Manhunt 2, which was edited down for retail versions of the game to get that M rating, but then there was an uncut adult-only version released exclusively for PC. Outlast 2 was a game that was edited down to receive an M rating instead of adults only, but Australia's own independent rating board actually refused to give a rating to the original version of the game, meaning it would have been barred from release in all of Australia until the edited version of the game was able to get that R18 rating, which is Australia's M rating essentially. Agony was cut down to reach an M rating, but eventually they released an uncut version later on Steam. And one of the earlier instances of a controversial rating decision was the game Thrill Kill, which was canceled in 1998 because of its subject matter and adults only rating, and never actually saw an official release. However, there's some more interesting controversies when it comes to the rating systems here, as adults only is also supposed to encompass things like gambling, which has always been banned from regular use in games that aren't adult only, but with the rise of loot boxes, this came into question again. But in 2017, the ESRB decided that loot boxes were not considered gambling to them and were fair game. For the gambling moniker, there's only a few examples we can actually look to. For instance, Peak Entertainment Casinos actually got the rating of AO, or gambling, which seemingly is in line for what Peak Entertainment expected when they released the game. Matter of fact, their public relations manager even stated in a press release that getting that ESRB rating of adults only was exactly what they wanted. The whole AO and M rated system isn't the only thing though that has shaped other games within the gaming industry either. Video game journalist Ben Kuchera actually noted that a sci-fi FPS game like Halo 3, whose level of violence in his opinion was comparable to that of Star Wars, would receive an M rating for blood, gore, mild language, and violence, and felt that it was odd that a game like Halo 3 share the same rating as Saints Row 4, which carries the blood, intense violence, partial nudity, sexual content, strong language, and use of drugs descriptor. Similarly, he pointed out that Saints Row and Halo get this M rating, though content in a PG-13 film like The Dark Knight could come across as harsher to children than that of a Saints Row game, pointing out ultimately that parents should be able to decide and know what's right and not right for their children. But yeah, he does bring up an interesting point. Is Halo 3 really that much darker and unsuitable for children than the PG-13 movie The Dark Knight? Also, of course, with Halo being an interesting example of people typically thinking that Halo was never fully deserving or needing an M rating, Halo 5 Guardians would be the first Halo game to pursue a teen rating instead of a M rating. And in the process of trying to reduce the violence and some of the other things that was peaking Halo over into the M rating direction, Halo 5 would get the T rating, though it seemed like the things that they had to change were pretty big sacrifices that ended in no real major result. Like, multiplayer's still there, except there's no quote-unquote killing because it's all just like a simulation game now. It was really weird. Also, after a while, ESRB started putting disclaimers that online interactions were not rated by the ESRB just because of the rise of voice communications and, you know, jumping on Modern Warfare 2, you can be called any name under the sun, and how's the ESRB supposed to put a fair rating for something like that? They want their hands clean from that, so they put that disclaimer. Ratchet & Clank's an interesting game. It got rated T by the ESRB despite being intended for children and receiving lower ratings from other boards in different countries. Like, it got a G rating from the ACB. Soldier of Fortune's interesting because in a rare occurrence, the Canadian province of Ontario actually overrode the ESRB rating and awarded the game their own quote-unquote restricted rating, as they felt like the extreme violence was too much for minors to have access to. This leads us into a whole other discussion when it comes to international rating systems. Lots of countries in Europe like the UK, France, Spain, etc. use the PEGI system for rating their games, which stands for Pan-European Game Information. Essentially, this age rating bracket starts off at the age of 3, which is suited for all age groups, and then goes 7, 12, 16, and 18, with 18 being for adults only. Then, just like the ESRB has, there's content descriptors that say what is in the game, like bad language, drugs, horror, gambling, sex, violence, and in-game purchases and discrimination. What? If there's any gambling in it, it's an automatic 12 rating, which most notably affected some of the Pokemon games in the past. If you remember, some of the remakes of Pokemon games actually lack the game corners that originally were in the game, and when games like Red and Blue re-released on the 3DS, they actually were rated PEGI 12 because of the gambling. Now, what is interesting though is that the NBA 2K actually got a bunch of controversy in 2019 when hyping up their new release by showing a bunch of loot boxes in the trailer, and the rating wasn't changed, with PEGI making a statement saying that the gambling descriptor only applies to content that teaches and encourages gambling. So Pokemon's not okay because it's fake gambling, but spending real money on loot boxes makes total sense. Then there's Germany, on the other hand, which is one of the few countries in Europe that has their own rating system called the USK, which stands for this word. This one starts at the young age of 0, for all age groups. Then it goes 6, 12, 16, 18. Now, Luke grew up with the system, and it's much stricter than other countries from his experience. Halo, for example, was mostly rated 18, so adults only. Same with Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto 5, Battlefield, and basically most shooters. The original Doom was even banned from sales in Germany, which wasn't lifted until 2011. Now, there also used to be some censoring that would have made for games to release in Germany and get a USK rating. For example, in Left 4 Dead 2, the bodies would fade away when you kill zombies, and in games like the Wolfenstein reboot, had to be replaced by something different. Nowadays, Germany is actually much more lax, and the last Wolfenstein even was allowed to have these German Beyblades for the context of like historical accuracy or context for a story. And Left 4 Dead 2 eventually did get a patch that updated the game back to the normal version. Now, these also have content descriptors as well, like for stuff like alcohol, violence, drugs, etc. But there are a few interesting ones, like a bunch of subcategories for violence, all on top of the normal violence moniker. Essentially, it's rating how realistic the violence in the game is. Obviously, there will be a bigger disclaimer if it covers the topic of a word we probably can't say in the video, but you guys get the point. Okay, then on the other hand, there's still another video game market, which is Japan, and they have their own rating system as well. Now, their rating system actually starts for A, which is all ages, which could cause some confusion from what the ESRB does, with A being like the worst thing. Then they have B, which is for ages 12 and up. Then it goes C, which is 15, D, which is 17, and Z, which is 18 and up. There are some content warnings that get printed on the box like other rating systems have, explaining some of the descriptors of the game. And then on top of that, there are still some restrictions as to what can actually be featured in the game itself. For instance, one of the biggest notable causes in recent years was Last of Us 2, which had a sex scene cut out of the Japanese version and then still got that Z18+ rating. Also, recently in 2022, Callisto Protocol developers refused to make changes to their game for the Japanese market, and because of that, the game wasn't able to get rated and wasn't released traditionally in Japan. Alright, and then you know what location does have some really interesting laws and rating systems when it comes to video games? China. Yeah. Over in China, they have a video game rating system known as the Online Game Ethics Committee, and the OGEC is responsible for reviewing and rating video games. Now, the committee is actually a part of the Greater State Administration of Press and Publication, which is a government agency that oversees the regulation of, in this case, video games specifically in the country. Now, one thing that's interesting though is China doesn't have a traditional age-based rating system like those found in other countries like the ESRB or PEGI. Instead, the OGEC primarily focuses on content evaluation, which includes elements of violence, sexual content, gambling, and politically sensitive topics. It's also worth noting that all video games released in China must undergo content review and obtain an official license from the OGEC before they can be legally sold or distributed within the country. Now, on top of all of that, the Chinese government has also implemented certain measures and guidelines, which applies to online games and imposes restrictions on the amount of time that kids can spend playing games. Now, these restrictions are enforced through real name registration and identity verification process. Under this anti-addiction system, players below 18 years old are typically limited to a certain number of hours of gameplay per day and may have further restrictions depending on things like if it's a school day or not. For a long time, the Chinese government imposed a ban on the sale of video game consoles. The ban was placed all the way back in 2000 and ran all the way until 2014. During this ban, the sale and distribution of consoles like the Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64 were actually prohibited in China, and as a result, these consoles did not have an official presence in the Chinese market. During the mid-2000s, there was a time period where Nintendo tried to circumvent some of these console bans by teaming up with other third-party companies to get their games to players in China. For instance, there was a device known as the iQ Player, which was a video game developed by iQ, a Chinese company and a subsidiary of Nintendo, and it was released in 2003 and designed specifically for that Chinese market. And the iQ Player was a unique system, to say the least. It offered a localized and cost-effective way for Chinese gamers to get to experience Nintendo games. Partially released because of the fact that Nintendo games were very popular in a bootlegged form during these years where Nintendo wasn't getting official releases over there. Now, the iQ primarily featured games from Nintendo's back catalog, including titles from popular franchises like Mario and Zelda and Pokemon. There was even a special rare Animal Crossing game that released on this console. If you didn't know, we have an Animal Crossing channel. Just gonna throw that out there here. Now, unfortunately though, the iQ ended up not really doing all that well, but originally was mostly just an aim at Nintendo to bolster the reputation of them as a video game publisher and to attempt to show that Nintendo games could be educational and a positive experience for younger players. But ultimately, the iQ didn't get the popularity that Nintendo had hoped for. In 2013, the Chinese ministry banned Battlefield 4 as they claimed it misrepresented China and was an attempt to smear China's image. And then, of course, in 2014, when the ban was officially lifted, which allowed consoles to be sold legally in China, by this point, the market had already evolved and newer console generations had taken over and gaming had become massive in China. We saw a ton of attempts during this time, though, from Western video game companies trying to get their foot in the Chinese market. Halo the Master Chief Collection would release on Xbox over in China. It would have some massive censorship added into the game to try to appease the OGEC. One of the biggest examples being the Flood will like shrink and disappear when you defeat them, and also a lot of the cutscenes were altered or framed differently to not interfere with some of the rating requirements that China has. Now, in more recent years, Nintendo has made efforts to re-enter the Chinese market, and besides a few years ago doing some interesting partnership with Nvidia, the Nintendo Switch was officially released in China in late 2019 through a partnership deal with the Chinese-based company Tencent. This became an interesting talking point for Nintendo fans across the board because in 2020, when you looked at the eShop available in China for the Nintendo Switch, there were 3 games available that had been approved for Chinese markets. So it just shows that there was a lot of scrutiny and work that goes into getting games approved for market there. In 2020, also Animal Crossing released, and that game became a massive hit for the Nintendo Switch and fans around the world. I mean, this is like the second best-selling Nintendo Switch game for context, just under Mario Kart. And with the lockdown that happened in 2020, a lot of people jumped to Animal Crossing to voice their opinions about many different things, one of those being the big Hong Kong protests, and a lot of Chinese players dedicated their island to the Free Hong Kong movement. In turn, China's government ended up choosing to ban Animal Crossing from China altogether, and the game is just not available anymore. Nowadays, it's interesting to see that there's just a handful of Nintendo Switch games actually available in China to buy and play on your Nintendo Switch, and it's just kind of a far cry from the library that's available in other countries. Persona 5 has like a mobile game that's releasing exclusively in China as of now, and this is technically a spin-off of the main Persona 5 story. Also, interestingly enough, they changed some things that typically have skull imagery and replaced them. However, the character Skull himself retains his same name. There's a big restriction when it comes to imageries of skulls, interestingly enough, in China and in video games. There was a lot of fan outcry a few years back with Rainbow Six Siege, a multiplayer game, when the developers stated that they had plans of pushing the game into Chinese markets and in turn would be removing certain references and aesthetics from the game to best fit into the requirements for a Chinese market. But to take out things like skulls in a game where there's like skulls on the wall, there's a character character that has like a skull as their face. There'd be a lot of other little references and things they'd have to remove also to get the game greenlit and approved for Chinese markets. Fans felt like they were just sacrificing too much of what the game originally was intended to be, and eventually Ubisoft ended up changing their mind based off of the fan backlash. Now, overall, when it comes to ratings in games across the board in any country, we all know that the main organizations that handle the rating systems definitely leave a lot to be desired, and you could really be on either side of the fence with this. You could be a concerned parent not wanting their kids to have access to a really violent video game, or you can be a gamer who feels like these restrictions limit what a game developer is able to put into their game, which would violate free speech or free expression. Where these two sides come together, though, is that the ESRB or PEGI, they don't really do a good job here. There's too many times where the ESRB has gone too harsh on games that definitely don't deserve the higher rating that it has, and then there's also been times where the ESRB has failed at listing some of the things that are featured on the game's disclosures. This has grown into a distrust between consumers and this organization, leaving most parents and players to really not trust what the ESRB is saying is the right rating. Like, let's look at Call of Duty, for example. Between Modern Warfare 2 and Black Ops 2, Call of Duty was at its peak in popularity. And if you were in voice chat, you knew majority of the people playing the game were not 17. Matter of fact, a lot of them weren't even like 12. Sure, some people might argue that it was bad parenting to let a teenager play Call of Duty, but the success of Call of Duty shows that parents are willing to look at a game that has that M rating and be like, nah, I don't agree with what the ESRB is saying. I think that my kid is mature enough to handle these topics. And this exact scenario happened to millions of players in that period of time. Nobody takes the ESRB seriously. Now, obviously, it's great that the ESRB isn't like the implications that China has for their gaming audience. There's also an interesting ABC News article from a few years back talking about the ESRB and their rating systems, and this quote we just found was really interesting. "My son sees violence and terrorism on the news daily, knows it's a reality, and technology, video games, allow him to act as one of the good guys battling terrorists." From Andrew Rhodes, a father of a 10-year-old gamer and a gamer himself, who wrote in an email, "When I was his age, all the kids in our neighborhood regularly played war with toy guns, we watched old World War II movies, and had Vietnam live on television." So for a long time, there's been this sentiment that video games cause violence, which there has been numerous studies done that disprove those claims. It's interesting how a lot of the times other outlets don't get the same scrutiny, like news media, television, movies, books. Only those darn video games, even though there's these studies to back up the very opposite of a lot of those claims. And of course, I think there should be restrictions in place to protect children, but the ESRB isn't cutting it. I genuinely don't know what the solution is and how things should proceed moving forward, so maybe we should open up the discussion. Does anyone have good ideas on how games should be handled when it comes to the rating system? We've identified the problem, how do we come up with a better solution? Leave your comments down below. Also, listen, if you need something good to drink, it's time you go ahead and pick up some Gamer Sups. We have an affiliate link with them, so if you use our code, we get a little cut of your order, and I genuinely love Gamer Sups. I drink that every day, multiple times a day, and I used to be the type of person to like never drink water, so this will help us support our channel and videos like this. Also, a huge shout out to our patrons. Thanks everyone for supporting our channel and, you know, keeping us afloat. Make sure you guys are subscribing, notifications on. That's it for today. We'll see you all next time with a new video.